connecting to the internet.
Internet.
Networking software.
World Wide Web thing on a computer today.
Computer.
NetSurfer Pro.
Hello and welcome to NetSurfer Pro, a whirlwind ride through the World Wide Web. I am your host, Matt, and with me is...
your co-host, Galen.
And, okay, I had, this State of the Meme planned about something about Resident Evil Village. You might be aware vaguely of what it's about if you've been following that game. But, okay, so it's like a week before E3, and the greatest video game trailer I've ever seen just dropped today. It is... I can't describe it, but I will describe it. So, if you're at home, feel free to look this up. Look up the trailer for Palworld. So, it's okay, so it starts off, it's like Palworld, and it has these cute little animals, very clearly Pokemon inspired, sort of a monster collector. Okay, so then the camera pans out, and it's this very Genshin Breath of the Wild-esque open world. You know, super generic nowadays, especially with Genshin being as big as it is, has the same amount of, saturation and bloom going on in the general color palettes. Very bland. I'm like, okay, I get it. It's open world, it's Pokemon, but then, as the player character is gliding on, this bird animal, underneath it, like the gliders in the other two games that I mentioned, they are shooting something with a gun, with bullets. Okay, so then it cuts back to they're raising their animals, they're farming with the animals. Then it cuts back to a gunfight. Music changes. It has the slap bass going on. There's a gunfight, but then the player character pulls out one of these Pokemon looking things, which is like this sheep. It's pretty much just Fluffle or Wooloo from Sword and Shield, and they use it as a shield to block bullets. Okay, then cuts back to a forest scene where the player uses a sniper rifle to hunt a boar-looking animal. Cuts back to the gunfight. They bring out a rocket launcher, shoot it. It collapses this tower into, destructible fragments. Okay, cut back to the animals. Then they have the animals, in clear pain, pushing these, devices as if they were, unethically slaved. I mean, slaves are unethical, but it's that they're, enslaved working for these devices, and it looks really bad and uncomfortable to watch. Cut to the gunfight again. They have, something that looks like Electivire or Electabuzz standing in front of them, blocking bullets while they use it for cover shooting. Cut back to the player character out of gunfire. They throw an electric animal into this water in a lake, and a bunch of dead water fish animals float to the surface. It's gone beyond feature creep into feature, it's just they saw 2020, 2021, 2019, saw the last 2.5 years of video games and were that, and then they put it into one trailer.
So I've been watching the trailer as you've been describing it, and you are spot on. I will say you did skip one important step, which is before the enslaved animals, pushing the rotating whatever, there is a scene of multiple animals in clearly a factory building guns.
Oh yeah, there's an assembly line.
As they are crying.
Yeah. It's bonkers. It feels like a joke. This is a company that has made a game before, and they already have a Steam page for this game. So it's not a fake game, but it looks like a fake trailer made to make fun of trends.
Yeah, this looks like the kind of game that would be a quick, Unity asset flip joke of, we made a game that's like Pokemon, but it's actually just about guns, but no, this is what this is.
Anyways,
this is just the game.
I had to talk about this because I'm sure there'll be a Donkey video next week about that trailer, so getting ahead of the game here.
Man.
Speaking of getting ahead of the game, fun segue there.
There's a lot of layers, much like the layers of the mind, the id, the ego, and the superego, which is also a layered joke about today's topic.
Yeah, we're talking, of course, about the podcast Super Ego, hosted by Mac. So we're talking about a video game that is sort of It's gone from cult classic status to sort of classic status in the span of about 2 decades. It has a sequel coming out this year. We are talking about Psychonauts. So I have a bit of a fact corner about the history of the development of the game.
Yes.
The Fact Corner.
So first we need to start with the history of Double Fine. Double Fine was a studio founded by Tim Schafer after he left LucasArts. Now, important thing you need to note is that LucasArts made adventure games first and foremost. Things like Secret of Monkey Island, for example, or Full Throttle, which is pretty relevant to a different Double Fine game. In this case, adventure game means the classic style of like you're going through a world and you have to gather items and solve puzzles, usually by interacting with the environment in some way, like combining items together or using keys on doors or stuff like that. Maybe insulting somebody really hard. So Tim Schafer left LucasArts, founded Double Fine. Then they were like developing Psychonauts because it was based off an idea that Tim Schafer had while making Full Throttle. And they at first were sort of scheduled to be a launch title for the original Xbox, and it was produced by Microsoft under the sort of supervision of Ed Freeze, the VP of game publishing for Microsoft at the time. But Double Fine had a lot of trouble meeting deadlines, and they had a lot of hard time kind of working with the tester feedback they got, and sort of they had to make some pretty big changes during that point. And by the time Ed Freeze left Microsoft in 2004, Double Fine had not actually finished Psychonauts, and so the new VP of game marketing or game production was like, no, this isn't working out for us, and Double Fine was left off the hook, or on the hook, I guess. They were left hanging until Majesco picked up the publishing and helped them ship the game when it finally released for PS2, Xbox, and PC. Now, Psychonauts was a sales flop, but it became a cult hit. Double Fine later made Brutal Legend, and that also was a sales flop. Afterwards, they kind of scaled down heavily. They started doing game jams, and then they produced kind of smaller indie scale games from there. Such games include like Costume Quest, Stacking, The Cave, and eventually they kind of made their return with Double Fine Adventure, also called Broken Age, which kind of put them in the spotlight again. And in 2020, they were bought by Microsoft, or like brought on as one of the official Microsoft studios. I think they are bought by Microsoft. And alongside that, they announced the official sequel for Psychonauts, Psychonauts 2. This is after roughly 15 or so years of no word of official sequel, and there was a VR spin-off, but that was not like a sequel, that was more of an interquel. So that's the basic overview of the development history of Psychonauts. Did you have anything else to add?
Not strictly, no.
So Psychonauts is a game, it's a 3D platformer where you play as a character named Rasputin, who ran away from his family with the circus and ran to a training camp / summer camp for psychic cadets. The Psychonauts are like a psychic military branch, secret service sort of thing, kind of X-Files-y, kind of Men in Black-y, and Raz had heard of them from like these pamphlets and all this, and their legendary tales and adventures. And the Psychonauts camp, the camp that everything takes place at, is sort of like a summer camp for young kids that have psychic capabilities, and Raz sneaks in to join them. The core gameplay is, like I said, 3D platforming. The levels are framed as you go inside somebody's mind, and so the levels take place in their mind and is based around their mind. And the game does a lot of cool stuff with that, which we'll talk about. We could do like a quick plot overview if you want.
Yeah, sure. So, at the beginning of the game is that you, as Raz, you are basically going to be picked up by your dad very soon. Like, you have snuck in and they'll let you stay, but they're like, well, we can't really, let you stay here as a camper because you haven't been, like, brought here. And so there's already a ticking time clock element. But so Raz is still allowed to go into Coach Oleander's brain for basic braining. Coach Oleander being like basically the head camper. He's like a big military guy, and so you bring him in. You bring yourself into his brain, and it's a war zone, and it's it's a tutorial level that's to teach you all about the basic jumping and combat mechanics, and all of your standard tutorial things. But then because Raz is like kind of interesting to the other agents, Mia Vidello and Sasha 9. Sasha is like, hey, you should come to my lab so that I can run some tests because your brain is unlike anything we've really seen. And so you go to Sasha's lab for some tests and slowly uncover a bit of a plot, basically. Because
this game has a bit of a plot.
Yeah, you could say this game has a plot. Much unlike many other 3D platformers of the era. But the interesting thing is that you go inside your own mind, Raz's mind, but it's clearly not entirely your own, and so somebody's is clearly like somehow interfering with your mind. And the like first act of the game is trying to figure out who that is, and you have to basically like unlock your standard kit of abilities in order to do that, which is Sasha's mind and Mia's mind. And is there one other? I don't think there's another mind in between.
Those give you your like range projectile laser beam psychic shot and your levitation ability respectively, which are both incredibly useful, frequently used throughout the rest of the game.
Yeah. So spoilers for a 20-year-old game, but
yeah.
Spoilers nonetheless. So Coach Oleander, it turns out, is the one who you're sort of mind melding with, and it turns out that Oleander has a like plot to do something. It's kind of uncertain. But as you figure this out, Sasha's like, no, there's Psychonaut business, and he runs out, and you can't really tell him anything. But Raz manages to like take the device that you use to enter people's minds from his lab, and so he kind of sets out himself to figure things out.
Right. The first thing is that there is a giant lungfish monster in the Lake Medulla Oblongata, and the lungfish monster has been sort of kidnapping kids and carrying them across the lake to an asylum, and so Raz goes and like kind of fights the lungfish, enters the lungfish's mind, helps it out, it becomes friendly. You learn that Oleander was like mind controlling the lungfish to do this. You go up to the asylum, it's pretty much in ruins. There's some people on the outside that seem to be former inmates, and you kind of go through, help them with their struggles. Eventually you sneak your way up to the very top of the tower, where you come face to face with sort of the other villain of the game, Dr. Lobato.
Yeah, Dr. Lobato is sort of like Dr. Lobato is introduced as the like first villain in Raz's mind, and so you think that he's just sort of a random guy who isn't really associated with anything else, and he is a little bit. Yeah, Dr. Lobato is the one who is actually directly like stealing people's minds, and so after the lungfish encounter, you track him, I believe, back to an asylum.
Yeah.
Which is where basically the latter half of the game is, as you are trying to gather pieces to like trick one of his lackeys into letting you into his lab, which involves going into the minds of 3 people in an insane asylum. Goodness.
Yeah. So once you reach the top of the tower, after gathering those pieces and finding your way in, you find that Lobato is harnessing the psychic power of really powerful psychic brains in order to power these brain tanks that he wants to use to take over the world. I think it's implied that Lobato he like brainwashed Oleander in some way, because in the post-game cutscene, Oleander says like, I have been cleared of the corruption that has caused me to want to take over the world or something, and he seems to be apologetic. Whereas Lobato, you just kind of punch in the face or something. So you help out Lobato's assistant, Shigor, and she and her turtle, Mr. Pokelope, get you inside, or get you to, like, break out Sasha and Mia's brains, which were captured already by Lobato. So you save Sasha and Mia, you save Lily, who is another camper, who is Raz's love interest, and is also, I think, already a Psychonaut by the time the story begins.
Basically.
Yeah. And you break them out of their, like, restraints and everything. Raz gets into a fight with the Oleander brain tank, because Oleander's brain is in a brain tank. And then in, like, the final moment, for the final level, Raz sends his own brain into the tank to interface with Oleander's brain to try to put a stop to it before the brain tank can, like, power up again. Then Raz helps Oleander kind of, like, come to terms with his own trauma and break out that, like, corruption that Lobato put in there. You also learn that Raz's dad was a psychic and I think a Psychonaut, and more so just didn't want Raz to be put in the way of danger, and so, like, didn't want him to join the Psychonauts because of that. Everything kind of gets resolved. The rest of the Psychonauts are able to disentangle Raz and Oleander's brains. Lobato is sort of locked up and sent out. Oleander is back to his normal self, and Raz becomes an official Psychonaut. That's sort of the
twist. At the very end, Sasha and Mia are like, someone's stolen the head of the Psychonauts. And they ask Raz to come along, and Raz looks at his dad, and he said, his dad's like, yeah, you go get him, son. And then they fly off in a jet. And
that's when the VR game picks up.
Oh, really?
In the jet.
But yeah, so that is the basic plot overview. Now, if you are sad at us for having spoiled this game, I would like to turn your attention to the game's manual. Yes, so back in the day, video games had manuals that you would read before playing the video game, sometimes, if you wanted to, maybe. And in the game's manual, it lists every collectible. Now, you might be saying, Galen, every collectible, surely, you know, it hides some of the collectibles, like, I don't know, the jarred brains of the kids that you have to collect. No. It lists the jarred brains, and it specifically says, when Oleander turns evil, he steals all of the brains with the help of Dr. Colagusto Lobato.
It's kind of hilarious with these game manuals that spoil the whole game, because, like, it's almost like they expect nobody to read them.
Yeah.
But they write them as if everyone's gonna read them.
But, I mean, Oleander is kind of, like, shown to be a villain after Act 1, kind of, like, maybe halfway through Act 2. It's a little bit halfway through the game.
Okay, he acts really sus. The biggest thing is that in the very first level, basic braining, there is a foreshadowing where, like, Raz starts walking towards this, like, curtain that's covering something on the wall, and Oleander's like, "You! What are you doing in my secret room?" And Raz is like, "Oh, I beat the obstacle course. I was just here. Nobody else was here." And he's like, "Oh, we'll never go in there again. Take this badge that says you completed basic braining. Goodbye forever."
You may not go in the East Wing. It is forbidden.
Yeah. So he does act a little sussy. There is a lot of good foreshadowing in this game. The other thing is that in basic braining, like, the first cutscene where you really interact with Lily, she is researching this, like, meat plant that is just lying on the ground. And so when you go into the brain tumbler experiment, which is sort of essentially the second level, you can probably notice that the meat plant's also there. Some other cool foreshadowing is that in the brain tumbler experiment, you find a, like, shadow monster, and that shadow monster, it turns out, has the same face as the lungfish. Also, there's a sink, it's like a bathtub, I think, which is sort of like the lake itself. But so, my favorite piece of foreshadowing, though, is really just around the lungfish. There's a character, Bobby Zilch, who's sort of a generic cartoon bully character, and he mentions, like, a lake monster in the first cutscene and scares one of the other kids. And then also there's a Russian kid who talks about a Russian bear, and then he says, like, "But there's a hairless bear. I've never seen a hairless bear. Bears in Russia have hair. And the hairless bear itself is the lungfish. So there's some fun little foreshadowing there.
Yeah.
But let's see. I think just going into the gameplay a bit more. So there are quite a few collectibles in 3D platformer from the 2000s fashion. The levels are pretty linear for the most part. I think there's a few sort of standouts that are a bit more open, but for the most part, the levels are pretty linear. And
over half of them are pretty linear, but specifically the Asylum ones are a lot more open-ended. And right. I really like that. I really like that sort of distinction, just because like the linear levels are almost entirely like basically some kind of tutorial, except for Boyd, except for the guard. But like the actual levels themselves are usually kind of more about teaching you something, and then once you have basically every tool, the levels themselves get a lot more open-ended.
So I like to think that after Mia's level and after the final time in the Brain Tumbler experiment is where the actual game begins. There's so many differences between the early game and post-BTE.
Yes.
Or like pre-Lungfishopolis and post-Lungfishopolis. And I really want to talk about that in a second. I just want to mention the collectibles really quick. This game it's really clever. There's a lot of like wordplay used to create game mechanics and game concepts. So, for example, the main collection you get is figments, or figments of your imagination. They're like these flat sort of 2D images that are made of one color. They kind of look like chalk drawings. And they float around, they fly around, they move around sometimes. They're sort of your coins or your notes in that they're the most common collectible. You have emotional baggage, which is, there's 5 of them in each level. They each require a specific baggage tag or a luggage tag. And then you can collect the tag or the bag itself. And your reward for getting all of them in a level is concept art, which is pretty cool. I like games that let you unlock behind the scenes stuff. There is cobwebs, which I think are like memory cobwebs or something.
Yeah, metal cobwebs.
Yeah, you need a special item to collect them, and it's necessary to get that item. And you buy the item with arrowheads, which are the like currency of the game. You use them to buy a couple different upgrades.
I do really like the joke of the arrowheads where a character very early on is like, don't you know, this camp was on an Indian burial ground? And Raz is like, wait, they buried their dead? And the other one's like, what? Ew, no, they just buried their arrowheads.
Yeah. So the final the final collectible you get in Mines is the memory vault. When the memory vaults are like a lot of lore. They'll typically be a character's backstory of like how they got to their point. There's a few really notable memory vaults that I'd want to talk about a bit later. But just keep them in mind. Memory vaults, there's, I think, at most 2 or 3 a stage. Not many, though. Then in like the real world, you have challenge cards and challenge markers, which let you rank up and upgrade your psychic abilities. There's sort of like a leveling system, and the higher level you are, the better some of your abilities get. And there's scavenger items, which are like a scavenger hunt, and I think it gives you some sort of reward when you fill it out, but I don't remember. And most of these you interact with, like the cobwebs, the challenge markers, the arrowheads, all of those you interact with a character named Agent Cruller. I want to say his name is Ford Cruller.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is like a really old psychonaut who's kind of going senile, but because of a rare like psychic mineral found under the camp, he's able to be sane enough and like aware enough to kind of issue commands from a command center. And because he doesn't really leave and he's kind of hidden, he's pretty much like the only official person Raz has contact with for most of the post-game. Or not post-game, the late game. He's sort of like a mentor character almost. He's like the Obi-Wan of the game.
Yeah.
Or the Yoda.
Crush my brain with psychic rock I must.
Yeah. So I have a criticism. Do you want to hear it?
Yes, I do.
So in collectathon fashion, a lot of the collectibles do have purpose. I love the wordplay, obviously. I love the the visualizing of an abstract concept. I love stuff like that. However, I do like that all 5 luggages give you concept art. I wish that individual luggages gave you something themselves.
Yeah.
I think the biggest culprit with this is the mental cobwebs. They are basically just walls, like, on their own, and clearing them all is a objective, but all they needed to do was make clearing one of them give you 50 arrowheads or whatever.
Well, you can trade them in for, I want to say, challenge cards at Ford Sanctum.
Oh shit, right.
Yeah. The one thing I will say though is that so arrowheads are really important, but you don't get many of them unless you buy the arrowhead dowsing rod, and even then, it's very easy to not get enough for the cobweb duster, as well as all the challenge cores you use to make challenge level ups when you get enough cards. If you don't bring the arrowhead to the bottom of the lake auto-scroller and get the arrowhead deposits there, which that's the one thing you can't replay is the bottom of the lake.
Yeah.
It's the one part of the game you can't revisit, so it is easy to miss a bunch of arrowheads, which will make your life harder by the time you need the cobweb duster. But, yeah, I mean, a lot of the level up bonuses aren't a huge deal. The chain burst from the laser blast is pretty nice, but I don't think you need to worry about maxing out your level a whole lot. The game's definitely built around you not needing to. The game's also built around you not needing levitation, which is something I'll get into in a bit, but I think I want to go level by level, because there's a lot I want to talk about, but I think it's easier to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, first though, I want to say, this game's aesthetic is very 2000s. The game is very Hot Topic, and Lobato and Crispin, his underling, look super Burton-esque. I wouldn't be surprised if the actual mad scientist from Nightmare Before Christmas was the inspiration for Lobato. They have that sharp mouths, or the sharp teeth and sharp mouths. Their voice is very exaggerated, or at least Lobato's is. A lot of characters have very, I don't know, Dan Povenmire, Jeff Swampy Marsh designs, where they'll have a basic shape for their head and then built around that. So for example, a lot of characters have very square or rectangular heads. Oleander looks like an egg, which is probably intentional actually, now that I think about it. Fred basically looks like an adult Phineas at times.
Yeah,
looks like a milk can, of course.
Yeah, the character designs are so incredibly interesting and incredibly varied. It is kind of a visual delight, honestly.
They're very surreal, sort of inspired, which I appreciate. It's kind of I don't remember the name of the artist, but it's the artist that made the Stinky Cheese Man and other storybook tales. That book, it reminds me of that artist's art. Something you'd find at a Scholastic book fair, and the people in 5th grade would buy it.
Yeah.
Okay, so level by level, the reason I want to do this is there's a lot to unpack, much like the emotional bags. So the big thing is that I think the first 3 levels, like you said, are very tutorialized. After those 3, it becomes a bit more complex in terms of their design, but the first 3 are very linear because they're meant to guide you, I guess. Basic braining, obviously it is a tutorial level and it introduces pretty much everything. There are some parts that aren't super well introduced, like the swinging between bars. That's not a huge deal. One thing I like though is that Raz being an acrobat kind of explains how he's so good at swinging on poles and bars and ropes and stuff. So there's this fun little in-universe explanation for that.
Yeah, I love the characterization of Raz, how they explain his typical 3D platformer kit in a very fun and diegetic manner.
Yeah. So, the one thing I want to say is that when you start basic braining, you're in like a military recruitment office seeing like a propaganda film, and then the wall falls apart in front of you and sees the rest of the level. But that's really the vibe that you get from Oleander. Like, they do a good job at setting up his vibe specifically in this level. I mentioned the foreshadowing at the end of the level, but even just like him being this kind of aggressive, like, join the military, you must fight for your country, if fighting is sure to result in victory, you must fight, that sort of thing. And like there's like all these little propaganda posters and like parodies of propaganda posters, but with Oleander's face. There's a lot of really small details. The figments are all like military related. One thing I do like is that they tend to use figments in ways that match the environment. So like in a part where Raz has to climb a ladder, there's figments of like military men climbing the ladder. Or in an area with floating platforms, there's a bunch of figments of blimps hovering around. So it's very like the figments are supposed to fit in their location. There's a really cool moment in the first level where like you open a hatch on a tank and you fall down, and then as you're falling, the gravity shifts and you're on the floor when it previously would have been like the wall behind you. It's more apparent in the second level, but this game does some things that Super Mario Galaxy would later get a lot of credit for that I think Psychonauts doesn't get enough credit for doing.
Yeah, the interesting, like, reality is whatever you make of it in the mindscape aspect is they use that to its full effect especially in later levels, but like it's a wonderful taste in the early level. I also like the actual figments themselves are almost always incredibly hilarious. Like, just what I know that one of them is like a skeleton that's in its outfit and stuff, or like some of them are just big monsters, some of them are like metals. They're always very fun characterization.
Mm-hmm. I like that. So when you're going into the level, Oleander's like, some of you may not survive this training, and it's all implied like this is all psychic training, it's not gonna harm them. You get in and you see people literally just explode for walking forward. It almost looks like there's not even anything that exploded them, and it's kind of great. Oh, it's like there's these two cheerleader kids, and they cheer you on while you're doing this like combat segment where you're punching down walls, and it's sort of like a rail shooter thing where if you punch the wrong ones, then you'll sorry about Discord pings, by the way, then you'll take damage. But afterwards they're like, "Yay, Raz, you did it!" And then they just explode anyways. It's this really sudden moment, and again, it's good characterization, but it's just really funny because everybody seems to be exploding.
Yeah, it's great because Oleander specifically blows them up as a reward.
Yeah,
and like the entire mini game, they are doing that. Woo, Raz, yay! And so like it's very easy to get annoyed with them, and so your reward being him blowing them up is just great.
Yeah, they do a lot to like make the other kids feel incompetent. There's a part where you have the option of guiding another kid through a minefield, and it might not be super hard, but it's one of those things where the kid is super slow, and you have to wait till he comes to a stop before you move him again. It's also like the kid that first warns about the lungfish, and I think he's the first to come back from getting his brain taken out.
Yeah, it's Dogen. He's the one that you see being bullied at the very beginning, and so like it's easy to have sympathy for him, but also like he is definitely characterized as just like, the little like weakling basically.
Yeah, the punching bag.
Yeah.
So after you do basic braining, you go to the brain tumbler experiment, which you go to I think 3 times throughout the game. The first time is like you go until you reach the shadow monster, and then that's your catalyst for talking to Sasha, or for doing his shooting gallery. And then the second time you go back and you go until you need to do Mia's thing. So the brain tumbler experiment is like entirely foreshadowing, pretty much just foreshadowing like a lot of stuff related to Oleander at the very end. I mentioned the lungfish. When you so after you get past the shadow monster and all that, there is a big tower made of like thorns and wood. And the second part of the brain tumbler experiment is passing past that part. And when you do, you actually see Lobato as he's taking the brains out of Dogen. You see it through like this tower in the brain tumbler experiment. I don't want to say it's not really meant to be a level, but in a lot of ways it feels like it's there for a playable cutscene.
Yeah, it is an interim level. Like, there is, some platforming and some things to do, but it's more like driving the plot forward than a playable level like the other ones.
Yeah. So the like actual second level is Sasha's shooting gallery. Sasha is one of the 2 Psychonauts agents that's there. He's sort of like a very like cut, even, orderly, kind of like no nonsense guy. And I'm trying to think of a good sort of comparison.
He's like a Mulder or Sully type. Sully. I think Sully was the
Scully?
Wait. No, Scully. Hang on, was Mulder the like skeptic of the 2?
I think it's Mulder.
I've never watched X-Files.
I think it's Mulder.
But yeah, he's that exact kind of, like government agent with sunglasses, kind of like, I talk very seriously. Come to my lab if you want to do things. He's not Russian. I don't know why I'm giving him the Russian accent. There's a Russian child.
So, Sasha, he brings Raz in afterwards to teach him how to use the psychic blasts. This is your main range projectile. Really good move. You can use it while you're doing front flips, back flips, and side flips, which is really good because it lets you be mobile while also attacking. You also get introduced to sensors, which are the main sort of generic mook enemy. The idea is that they are trying to erase any thoughts that aren't supposed to be there, which happens to include other people. The idea is that like Oleander, I guess, has prepped his mind so much for it that he didn't need sensors, or he didn't have sensors in his basic braining, whereas for like everybody else there are going to be sensors at some point.
Yeah.
Especially because Sasha wasn't expected to have anybody else inside his brain. So you learn your Psyblast ability there. So you start on this big cube, which is all kind of adorned with different black and white patterns. And he's like, all right, practice your shooting on this sensor enemy. It'll keep spawning. If you do it for 30 years, you'll get good at it. And so Raz is like, fuck that. I'm going to go have fun. There's this little dial that you have to interact with that ups the rate that the monsters spawn. If you turn it all the way to the skull mode, the actual level begins, where like part of the cube opens up and it reveals all these like furniture and stuff, and it's all these memories of Sasha's childhood that he's sort of held back, and you have to shoot these specific targets to sort of close that part of the cube. And if you do this a few times, you'll eventually fight a boss fight. Something I love is that Sasha gets visibly distressed during this part, to the point where like it feels like the stuff Raz is doing is affecting him in some way beyond just like annoying him. I think the sort of theme is that Mia and Sasha have like coping mechanisms in place, I guess, and that helps them be an effective Psychonaut. And both their levels kind of represent how they do that. For Sasha's case, it's this very compartmentalized thing. And if you look at his memory vault, you see that his childhood was like his mom died and then his dad went through a lot of trouble. And so like the first piece of furniture that appears is like a crib, and then there's like a bunch of canned food with a tape measure connecting them. It's sort of set up to also look like a child's mobile. You know, the thing that hangs and has like dangly things.
Yeah. The other great thing that happens in this level is that, so the crux of the actual, like, how you are, like, fixing things is that you're turning off all of the sensors. And once you do it, Raz is like, I did it. I got them. And Sasha's like, well, I hope this was a learning lesson. And Raz is like, yeah, never never let any, never let anything ever bother you, or something like that. And he's like, and Sasha's like, well, no, if you completely compartmentalize all of your trauma, basically, then, it can just basically explode. And Raz is like, so, like, say if I were to turn off all of the sensor producers, and he was like, oh, definitely, like, back up until, and then explosion, as they turn behind them and see a giant sensor, which is then the boss.
Yeah.
And so, like, I love the, like, number one, it's a good joke. Number two, I also love the, theme of it, where, like, Sasha is very, despite still having his trauma, is very, like, emotionally intelligent and realizes, if you just completely bottle everything up, then it's just going to explode. So, yeah, it ties in more with the, like, it is a funny game and an interesting game, but it also does very well to, like, actually explore the human psyche within a level.
Right.
And how it can manifest.
Yeah. So after you do Sasha's shooting gallery and you get the ability to shoot things with your mind, you go back through the BTE, you see that you need to be able to float, and then you go to Mia, who is actually teaching a class on levitation. Now, quick note about the levitation ability. It puts a ball underneath Raz that you kind of roll around on in an almost Sonic-esque way. It also builds up momentum. So if you go down like a big hill, you'll have faster speed and you can like jump off it more. You can even do a Tony Hawk like back and forth around a half pipe to keep gaining height. Here's the other thing though. The momentum building carries over to every other like part of the game. So even if you're just walking and you walk down a slope, if you jump, you can gain extra speed. So you can bunny hop. There's a little fun bit there. Also though, you can hold a button in midair to float, so you slowly descend. You already start with a double jump, so this is just another way to like better manage your air movement, which is kind of common in 3D platformers. A like correction ability. It lets you travel pretty long distances. If there are jets of some sort underneath you, you can use it to float up. This is kind of like, it's kind of like pretty typical 3D platformer ability as far as that goes. I mean, we're talking about Breath of the Wild, that has a glider ability which works pretty much the same way. So that's all pretty standard. What bothers me though is that there are so many levels that are completely, like, a lot of platforming can be circumvented by levitation. Especially two specific other levels, the tower climb at the end of the game in Waterloo. And so it bothers me because it's like they clearly have designed a level around levitation, and then they just let you kind of skip a bunch of other things with it. It feels like they were expecting players to switch it off and on more, but since levels tend to become really big after Mia's level, it's sort of like, why wouldn't I always have levitation on? Basically, it's a little poorly thought out.
Yeah, it's 3D platformers every once in a while kind of have that problem where like they have a specific tool set and they think about that tool set in exactly one scenario or like, one-to-one usage, but they don't have the realization or think about like how it could ultimately be used to skip other things. That I think that sort of later like examples of platformers and later homages to platformers think about a lot more.
Mia's level, she is very groovy, like what is that, 60s, 70s? I don't know my decades. 70s style, very hippie-esque. So
it's extremely like No One Wants to Live Forever, or is that what No One Lives Forever? Is that the video game? I think that's the video game.
It's very like Austin Powers.
Yeah, it's great.
That like yeah. So her level is all about levitation. She is bubbly. You use a bubble, you ride on bubbles, lots of bubbles. There is a part where you're going vertically up this like, I don't know, circular room, and it's really tall. There's like a bowl at the bottom that you can run around on to gain speed. There are also these like brown rings that you go through to activate some like shortcut. I didn't realize that was a thing. I just kept gaining speed again and again and again to keep going really high. And it took me forever to actually get enough height to actually like get up to the ladder that you need to go through the rest of the level. So that was a mistake on my part. Also, Mia's level has a pretty well-known Easter egg, which isn't really that hidden, off that big circular room, where you can find her like traumatic backstory, which is that she worked at an orphanage and the orphanage burned down and she could hear the screams of all the children in her mind. And if you open like a toy box in that room, you can jump into it and you go to this like hellscape area with all of these like creepy, weird looking monsters, and they're like whispering really loudly. It's one of those things where like if you have a phobia of creepy whispers, do not check it out.
Yeah. It's good.
The monsters reappear in a later level, and they're revealed to be essentially nightmares. I think what's interesting is that as opposed to Sasha, where like his trauma was bottled up, Mia's is to the side, but she has its own place constructed for it. There's like furniture and stuff there that's unique to that location. And so it feels to me more like she is able to like set it aside and acknowledge it without having to like hide it completely.
Yeah. Mia's level is interesting, but it's also very like, it is still very linear. That is not really the case once that level is done, the meat tumbler is completed, and then you do the lungfish.
Hey, this is post-production Matt. This episode went pretty long, as you can see if you're familiar with the game. So we are splitting this into 2 parts. This is the end of the first part. So just to quickly wrap things up, thank you for listening. You can follow us on social media at NetSurferPro on Facebook and Twitter. You can give us a like on any podcasting platform, any review, let us know how we're doing. You can let us know what you'd be interested in us covering. If there's any topics that seem cool, we're always happy to hear back. And I think that'll be it for now, so catch us next week where we finish off Psychonauts.